Founded in 1922, just months after the Soviet Union began, Spartak Moscow was known as the People's Team due to having no government involvement. This is because most clubs at the time were owned by state institutions such as the police or the army. As you may have guessed, this is where Spartak's rivals, Lokomotiv Moscow's name comes from, as they were founded by the Soviet Transport Ministry. As is often the case with Russian sports teams, Spartak's history was political from the start, with its founder Nikolai Starostin serving 10 years in a gulag for allegedly trying to assassinate Joseph Stalin during the Great Purge. When Stalin died, Starostin returned to footballing duties and in true Soviet fashion, just got on with it, building Spartak Moscow into a footballing powerhouse alongside his brothers. In many ways, Starostin's struggle stayed with Spartak until the modern era, as the club also endured tough times both on and off the pitch, such as a shock relegation in the 1970s and a crowd tragedy in the early 1980s which left 66 people dead. The incident took place against Dutch outfit HFC Haarlem and remains controversial to this day. Known as the Luzhniki disaster, this remains the greatest death toll in Russian footballing history, with some historians arguing the real number is far greater and surpasses over 300 dead. During the Luzhniki disaster, icy conditions led to a crowd surge which quickly grew out of hand after a fan had fallen down while a goal was scored at the same time, causing the crowd to rush forwards. Despite its struggles, Spartak Moscow is easily the biggest club in Russia, having won the most amount of league championships, meaning its honours list is not small. Speaking of honour, the club doesn't just do business on the pitch, as Spartak Ultras are globally feared due to their organisation, combat training and professionalism. One key hooligan group for Spartak is the Gladiators, who were founded in 1996. Their nickname comes from Spartacus, who the club's name is also based upon. In some ways, this is fairly fitting, as both Hooligans and the character Spartacus fought as a way of life. The Gladiators aren't just a group of loud drunkards looking for a scrap either. They succeeded due to taking hooliganism very seriously. And unlike many European hooligan firms, they follow Russian rules and consciously tried to move away from the previous taste of hooliganism, which was influenced heavily by the UK and Italian firms. This means often fighting in pre-arranged, secluded areas far away from CCTV or police officers, with an emphasis on discipline and physical strength for its members. Taking a closer look at Spartak Ultras, the other main hooligan group is called the Fratria, which translates to brotherhood in Latin and was founded in 2005, which was arguably the golden age for Russian hooliganism. Although the Fratria has its fair share of enemies, it also has a couple of clubs that it's relatively friendly with, which isn't too unusual within Ultras culture. These clubs are Serbia's Red Star Belgrade and Gate 7, the Ultras of Greek club Olympiakos. You may be wondering why these clubs are friendly with each other, and really the main answer is religion. All three clubs share Orthodox Christianity, meaning they're bound by faith, and when it comes to Spartak hooliganism, identity is a very big deal. As mentioned, due to taking fighting seriously, many of Spartak hooligans aren't just untrained thugs. They're gym goers who are also trained in mixed martial arts such as kickboxing, sambo and wrestling, and aren't afraid to use their skills when brawling. In many ways, you could argue that Russian hooliganism is an evolution of European hooliganism, as it's far more organised and efficient, rather than just chance encounters with the enemy. Over the years, Russian hooliganism has had to increasingly become even more organised and go underground to survive against authorities. While the state may have accepted it decades ago, it looks as though times within Russia are finally changing. Speaking of Russian football evolution, Hooligan culture didn't really enter Russia until the 1980s. Although this is later than many hooligan groups across Europe, it's fair to say that the country is more than made up for it since the 90s and early 2000s, being seen as many as the peak hooliganism era in Russia. And even though Spartak fans are feared on the global stage, we shall get into this later. For now, we'll focus on their main enemy, CSKA Moscow. Although the club has also had beef with Dynamo Moscow and Zenit, it's undoubtedly CSKA who are their main nemesis. Of course, locality has a lot to do with this. However, as is often the case with footballing grudges, it's also intertwined with culture, class and history. This rivalry dates back to the early days of the Soviet Union. On the one hand, CSKA represented the upper echelons of the Soviet Union, whereas Spartak was the common man. Here, we had a state institution as a football club against a group of poor workers. The clue is literally in the name, with CSKA standing for Central Sports Club of the Army, which involved high-ranking officers in very privileged positions, while Spartak was named the People's Team. Although the Soviet Union has long gone, the working class proletariat versus higher class beef is still deeply embedded into Russian culture. These days, a typical affair includes flares being thrown, fires, divided walls, and plenty of busy riot police. This isn't just a local affair though. Unlike many firms, Spartak will fight anyone, even if they're from hundreds of miles away from an obscure town in the lower leagues of Russia. Here, Spartak fans may even be extra cautious when fighting to avoid an upset off the pitch, just like their team does when facing lower league opposition on the pitch. As previously mentioned, the Moscow hooligan rivalry between Spartak and CSKA began properly in the 1980s. Unsurprisingly, this is when the Soviet Union began to become less isolated and more influenced by the West. Here, hooligan groups popped up and rivalries became more intense than ever. However, it wasn't until the early 90s when ultras Russian culture began to thrive and grow. This is understandable, as the collective of communism died out and was replaced with nationalism and tribalism, which Spartak fans embraced massively. Known as the main Moscow Derby, or Derby of the East, in the internet era, this has become the stuff of legend, with videos emerging of fans literally fighting in Russian forests to avoid police scrutiny. Whilst in and around the stadiums, it isn't uncommon to see Russian ultras cover their faces with scarves or balaclavas. The reason for this isn't due to the cold weather, it's to remain anonymous when causing trouble. As seen, some of the forest fight techniques look more akin to an MMA fight than a casual street scrap, with many of the hooligans boasting athletic and muscular physiques. This is a far cry away from your typical English hooligan sporting a visible beer belly. Further adding to the organisation element, these bouts often take place with unofficial referees who keep things in order and try to keep the fights as fair as possible. On a similar note, in 2005, Spartak hooligans notoriously also gathered en masse to fight Zenit St. Petersburg hooligans in an empty car park. Bizarrely, this took place in the middle of various high-rise tower blocks without a single police officer in sight. Although they're based in a completely different part of the country, Spartak fans often view Zenit fans as part of the establishment. This is because of Zenit's involvement with sponsor and gas company Gazprom, who financed the club's success for many years. Of course, there is some irony here though, as these days Spartak fans are hardly Bolshevik proletariat themselves and are based in one of the most wealthy parts of the country. Culturally, you could argue these pre-arranged fights in the middle of nowhere are fairly unique to Russian football hooliganism and don't happen too often in other countries, which is especially the case with forest fighting. You may be wondering why these fights have been forced underground. However, there's a very practical reason. As Russian hooliganism grew throughout both the 80s and 90s, the Russian authorities began to clamp down hard. In 2021, a mandatory fan ID system was introduced as a way of limiting fan violence. Interestingly, more recently, the pendulum against Russian hooliganism has well and truly swung in favour of the state, and it's not to do with saving face for a potential domestic World Cup. In an article written by Mikhail Loginov, he claimed Soviet propaganda used to make much of the fact that Western society was on a downward path. Football hooligans, usually British or Italian, were quoted as an example of this disintegration and blamed for unrest at stadiums. So when viewed from the perspective of authoritarian state control, you can see why fans opted for private battles away from prying eyes. In its own twisted way, this is arguably better for society than street or stadium fights, as it means innocent passers-by won't get hurt, nor will buildings get damaged. In other words, you can go to one of these fight club meetups, you know exactly what to expect, and you can't complain if you come away with a few broken bones. Aside from the fan ID system, there is even more evidence that for some time Russian authorities have tried to clamp down on hooliganism, at least to some extent. Before 2021, one of the main reasons for this was hosting the 2018 Russian World Cup. Just years before, in other foreign ventures, Russian hooligans had caused quite a stir abroad, such as their infamous clashes with English fans in Marseille. In response to this, a BBC documentary claimed that Russian ultras would be targeting English fans on home soil. In true Spartak fashion, their fans doubled down without shame. At one game following the BBC expose, they unhurled a tifo which read, BBC blah blah channel. This featured two balaclava-wearing hooligans holding both a scarf and a machete. Adding to the controversy, a Spartak fan claimed 100% guaranteed that something would happen to English fans during the World Cup. It wasn't just hooligan violence that threatened to sour the 2018 World Cup either. As has often been the case with Russian culture for years, cries of racism were also vocalized. Bizarrely, Spartak's official Twitter account helped fuel the fire with a video of 3 of their black players on the pitch, the clip being captioned, 3 chocolates melting in the sun. To make matters worse, around the same time, Liverpool forward Bobby Adekanye, who was born in Nigeria, was targeted by racist chants and gestures from Spartak Moscow supporters during a UEFA League youth match in Moscow. With that said, it's easy to see how the original Twitter caption wasn't exactly appropriate given the timing or historical context of the club and its relationship with racism. In fact, ethno-nationalism has been in the background of Spartak's culture for years, as we shall visit shortly. To combat this, the FSB was ordered to actively go after hooligans to avoid potential international embarrassment in time for 2018. This was a new policy which had not been enforced for decades of Russian football beforehand. For those wondering, the FSB is an acronym which translates into English as the Federal Security Service and is effectively the Russian equivalent of the FBI. Because of its hardline interference, domestic hooliganism has never quite reached the highs as it did in the 90s or the early 2000s. Interestingly though, the FSB's involvement doesn't end there. According to various Western sources, it actively promoted Russian football hooliganism before the clampdown. This was to supposedly encourage right-wing, ultra-nationalistic tendencies amongst young Russian men. Put simply, you could say that the FSB has a complex history with ultras and has allegedly worked alongside them and against them at times for its own benefits. For instance, one of the most clear examples of football hooliganism and ethno-nationalism with Spartak can be seen with the military group, the 88th Reconnaissance and Sabotage Brigade. Alongside CSKA and Zenit fans, this saw various Spartak fans go and fight in the Ukraine-Russia war. It seems very evident then that nationalism and hooliganism are closely related in Russia. However, Spartak fans haven't always done the bidding of their government. Going back to 2010, things got bloody on the streets of Moscow when hundreds of Spartak fans protested outside the Kremlin. This was due to the death of Spartak fan Yegor Sviridov, who was shot dead by a rubber police bullet weeks before. The reason for the initial police interference was due to Sviridov fighting with Aslan Cherkesov from the Caucasus. During the protest, Caucasus passerbys were also attacked as Spartak fans yelled "Russia for Russians." In 2015, further Spartak nationalism was displayed when the club was fined £8,600 after neo-Nazi images were displayed in a game against Arsenal Tula. This happened just 2 years after Spartak fans unveiled a literal swastika banner in a cup game against Shinnik Yaroslav. Of course, the irony is not lost here. Like most Russian ultra groups, the Spartak fans can be described as fiercely patriotic to the point of racism. There is of course a contradiction, considering it was the left-wing Soviet Union which helped defeat the Nazis themselves, with the Battle of Stalingrad playing a key role in whipping up Soviet nationalism. Still, it's not that rare to see Nazi runes or symbols at Spartak games. Regardless of history, decades later, it seems as though practically all of the hooligan groups in Russia have turned towards Nazi ideologies. Whilst many clubs across Europe have ultra-right-wing fan groups, it has to be said this is a small percentage. Russia probably has the most, with no real left-wing ultra groups of note. As ever with covert organisations, government influence is a murky world filled with rumours and misinformation. Having said this, both theories can make sense at the same time. It's fully plausible that before the Russian World Cup, the FSB encouraged hooliganism, and has done after it concluded, to promote the Russian-Ukraine war. Understandably though, before the historically recent government clampdown, Russian ultras really did run riot. This wasn't just exclusive to football matches either. In some cases, Spartak fans would literally fight in the stands against CSKA fans in other sports too. Most noticeably, this happened at ice hockey games, proving that it was barely even about football and was more about local pride and the excuse for a good punch-up. And even though things have cooled a little in recent years, don't believe Spartak's ultras have completely gone away, as this would be incorrect. Despite government attempts in 2018, this was also the year when a Spanish policeman died during clashes with Spartak fans who visited Athletic Bilbao. Here, 51-year-old Inocencio Alonso Garcia had a heart attack while trying to stop trouble outside the stadium. In total, 500 police officers were present that night, with just 5 fans being arrested. After these incidents, UEFA condemned the violent clashes. However, as we have seen, fines and stadium bans aren't too unusual for Spartak fans due to years of controversial behaviour. In summary, it's no exaggeration to state that Spartak hooligans are some of the most brutal in world football, with a dangerous reputation to match. Perhaps the main reason for this is due to the culture of Russian football to begin with. Here it took from Western Europe's principles of matchday violence, but added an organised, serious, almost military element which may date back to the Soviet culture of authority and still has its mark on the country to this day. And even though violence looks to have lessened since the 2018 World Cup, it seems as though Russian hooliganism is still alive and active, with the FSB now turning its eyes to more serious matters such as the Ukraine war. Combined with being a club that originated for true working class men, it's fairly easy to see how Spartak Moscow became so dominant when it came to both domestic and international hooliganism. Speaking of domestic issues, it's no surprise that a country with a fairly low living wage also bred hooligans. Even though the style may have an Eastern European taste, it's true that like original English hooligan firms, many of these violent acts can be traced back to deprivation, frustration, and boredom amongst young men. As for the future of Spartak Moscow's ultras and their reputation, it looks as though violence and ultranationalism go hand in hand. It may seem appalling to outsiders and nothing to do with the actual game of football, but nonetheless for some Spartak fans, it's more than a way of life and is something they'll die for. At the same time, you could argue that the future of Spartak's hooliganism and Russia's football hooliganism, on the whole, is growing ever more dependent on the government and how it chooses to view ultra groups, as pawns for their own bidding or nuisance groups that belong in the 90s. Based on this, like many parts of Russian life, Spartak hooliganism is no different as it grows ever more dependent on President Vladimir Putin and whether he chooses to tolerate them or kick Russian hooliganism to the curb for good.